The morning of October 30th, 2025 began like any other election day in Tanzania, quiet, cautious, full of promise. But within hours, the silence shattered. Smoke began to rise from Dar es Salaam, gunshots echoed across Mwanza, and by noon the streets were no longer places of celebration, they were battlefields. This was not just another election gone wrong. It was a nation's breaking point. For months, ordinary Tanzanians had watched as President Samia Suluhu Hassan tightened her grip on power, silencing critics and disqualifying her two biggest rivals. When the ballots opened that morning, many already knew the outcome: of victory without competition, a democracy without choice. And so they decided to make their voices heard in the only way left to them: through defiance. On that fateful afternoon, men and women, young, old, educated, poor, marched toward the heart of Dar es Salaam chanting, "These are our taxes, these are our lives." At a gas station owned by a powerful ruling party figure, the people stormed in, seizing cooking gas cylinders, small blue tanks that in that moment became symbols of survival, dignity, and resistance. "This is more than protest," one man shouted. "This is a statement." Across the nation, fires lit up the skyline. The government imposed curfews, cut off the internet, and deployed the army. Yet the people kept marching. Fear was no longer stronger than hunger or hope. And now, as the world watches Tanzania burn, one question looms large. Is this the birth of a new revolution or the last breath of a dying democracy? Because what is happening here is not only about politics, it's about trust, fairness, and the very soul of a nation once called the oasis of peace. Stay with us as we uncover what really happened on Tanzania's election day, the day democracy met resistance. Please subscribe, share, and leave your thoughts, if you believe the truth deserves to be heard louder than propaganda. When the sun rose over Tanzania on October 30th, 2025, there was already tension in the air, a sense that something would break. In Dar es Salaam, the country's largest city, voters arrived at polling stations only to discover that two of President Samia Suluhu Hassan's main rivals had been officially barred from the race. The disqualification came just days before the vote, sealing what many described as a coronation, not an election. By mid-morning, angry voices began to swell in the streets. Groups of young people waving torn posters and national flags gathered near the city center. Videos uploaded before the internet blackout showed police trucks moving in formation, officers armed with tear gas and live ammunition. "We are not afraid anymore," one young woman shouted into a phone camera. "If they silence our votes, we will speak through the streets." Soon, chaos spread far beyond Dar es Salaam. In Mwanza, on the shores of Lake Victoria, hundreds stormed a gas station owned by a member of the ruling Chama cha Mapinduzi CCM party. What began as an act of protest turned into a symbol of rebellion. Men, women, even children carried off blue gas cylinders, not as looters, but as citizens reclaiming what they said was already theirs. "These are our taxes," a protester yelled as others cheered. Those small tanks of gas normally used for cooking became emblems of survival and defiance. Within hours, Tanzania's major cities, Dodoma, Morogoro, Mwanza, and Dar es Salaam, were engulfed in unrest. Protesters built barricades out of burning tires, wooden planks, and iron sheets. Police responded with tear gas and gunfire. Witnesses reported snipers on rooftops. Ambulances struggled to reach the wounded as hospitals filled up. By evening, unconfirmed reports indicated at least 17 dead and dozens injured. Journalists attempting to document the protests were detained or forced offline. The internet blackout imposed nationwide, silenced digital voices, but not the movement itself. In the absence of social media, protesters turned to Zello, an old walkie-talkie app, to coordinate marches, share safe routes, and warn each other of police movements. At the same time, President Suluhu's government declared a state of emergency, citing national security concerns. Curfews were enforced from dusk till dawn. Soldiers patrolled neighborhoods while armored vehicles guarded government buildings. But even under the threat of force, citizens continued to gather after dark, lighting candles, singing the national anthem, and calling for democracy, not dictatorship. For many, this uprising was the culmination of years of frustration. Tanzania's ruling party, CCM, the self-proclaimed party of the revolution, has governed uninterrupted since independence. Under Samia Suluhu, once celebrated as the nation's first female president, critics say the promise of reform collapsed into repression. Opposition leaders were jailed under vague security laws, journalists were silenced, and civic groups were dissolved. The election itself only deepened that sense of betrayal. With her two main rivals removed, Tandulu jailed on treason charges, and Luhaga disqualified on technicalities, Suluhu effectively ran unopposed. The Electoral Commission's announcement that she had won over 90% of the vote in some regions was the final insult. It confirmed what many already feared, that the system was rigged long before ballots were cast. And so Tanzania burned not from an act of foreign interference, but from its own people's despair. By nightfall, the streets glowed red from fires, and the sound of gunfire mixed with the chants of justice echoing through alleyways. In those chaotic hours, a powerful message emerged. The people were not simply rebelling against one leader, but against decades of silence. This was their awakening, the moment Tanzania's long-buried anger erupted into the open. As darkness fell on October 30th, Tanzania crossed a line it could no longer retreat from. The protests that began as spontaneous marches turned into a full-scale national uprising. Dar es Salaam's city center flickered under the orange glow of burning barricades. Mwanza's narrow streets echoed with the crackle of gunfire. The nation was trembling, and the people no longer feared the tremor. The government responded with the weight of its entire security apparatus. Armored vehicles rolled through the streets, and drones hovered low over neighborhoods where resistance was strongest. General Jacob Makanda, the head of the armed forces, appeared on national television, his voice calm but cold. "We are defending order. We are defending property. These people are enemies of progress." But to the thousands of Tanzanians outside, the message was clear. The state was declaring war on its own citizens. Witnesses described the night in Dar es Salaam as one of chaos and courage. Police fired live rounds into crowds. Tear gas blanketed city squares. Yet men and women held their ground, banging pots and pans, chanting, "Freedom cannot be jailed." When ambulances could no longer move through the smoke, volunteers formed human chains to carry the wounded to safety. Others used walkie-talkie apps to map police movements in real time, turning resistance into an organized network of survival. In Mwanza, near Lake Victoria, the gas station takeover became the flashpoint of national symbolism. Footage smuggled out before the blackout showed hundreds of blue gas cylinders stacked like trophies, guarded by civilians chanting, "These are our taxes." That image spread across Africa before the internet went dark, a single photograph that captured the rebellion's heart. By midnight, hospitals were overwhelmed. Unconfirmed counts spoke of over 30 killed and hundreds injured or detained. Bodies lay covered under torn banners bearing the slogan, "Peace, Unity, Freedom." Electricity was cut in several neighborhoods, leaving entire districts in blackout, literal and digital. Meanwhile, President Samia Suluhu Hassan addressed the nation briefly, calling the protests criminal acts designed to destabilize the republic. Her words carried an air of distance, a president speaking about her people, not to them. The irony was not lost on anyone. The leader, once hailed for her humility, now appeared insulated from the cries outside her own palace walls. As curfews tightened and arrests mounted, the international response began to unfold. Amnesty International condemned the killings as deeply disturbing and urged restraint. The European Union labeled the election fraudulent, accusing Tanzanian authorities of systemic manipulation. The U.S. Embassy in Dar es Salaam warned its citizens to shelter in place and avoid public areas. Across the border, Kenya closed checkpoints at Namanga, where clashes had already left 2 dead after protesters tried to flee the violence. Despite this, no major international power intervened. The world watched cautiously, diplomatically, and mostly in silence. Inside Tanzania, however, something irreversible had happened. Fear had changed sides. For the first time in decades, citizens no longer whispered about corruption. They shouted it. Teachers, factory workers, students, mothers, people who had never attended a rally before were suddenly united under one shared realization that silence was complicity. In Dodoma, the capital, hundreds of youth gathered outside Parliament, lighting candles and singing hymns. A young man stood on the steps and shouted, "We are not criminals. We are the future." The crowd erupted in applause before police charged again. The crackdown grew brutal, but so did the resolve. Across social networks, the few that still functioned through VPNs, Tanzanians shared the same phrase. "We have been silent for too long. Tonight, the nation speaks." That night marked the emotional climax of Tanzania's awakening. The people had tasted the air of rebellion thick with smoke and courage, and even as the state pushed harder, the spirit of defiance had already spread beyond control. This was no longer a protest. It had become a reckoning. By dawn on October 31st, Tanzania had changed forever. The smoke over Dar es Salaam had thinned, but its meaning hung heavy in the air. Streets once filled with chanting now echoed with the silence of exhaustion and mourning. What began as a protest over an election had become a mirror reflecting the fragility of the Tanzanian state itself. In the capital Dodoma, the government moved swiftly to reassert control. Mass arrests swept through opposition strongholds, with hundreds detained under emergency decrees. Lawyers who attempted to represent the detainees found courthouses surrounded by soldiers, hospitals filled beyond capacity, forcing medical staff to treat the wounded on floors. The few journalists still reporting from the ground spoke of families searching for missing relatives, young men who had vanished overnight. But repression could not conceal the cracks now spreading through the nation's political foundation. For the first time in decades, even members of the ruling party CCM began to question the leadership's methods. Some local councillors quietly resigned, others refused to enforce curfews. Behind closed doors, civil servants whispered about the danger of continuing a system that had outlived its legitimacy. In the private sector, the effects were immediate. Small businesses shuttered as curfews paralyzed commerce. Markets that once buzzed with trade turned into ghost towns. Fuel prices spiked after key supply routes were blocked by protesters or soldiers. "We can't live like this anymore," said a shop owner in Dar es Salaam. They talk about stability, but there is no life left in this stability. The internet blackout, intended as a tool of control, had an unexpected outcome. It pushed Tanzanians toward offline unity. Communities began organizing through word of mouth, through churches and mosques, through neighbors and whispered plans. In a society long fragmented by fear, the crisis had built something new: solidarity. Culturally, the events of October 30th reignited the memory of Nyerere's era, the founding years when Tanzania's independence carried a moral purpose. Across universities, students spoke of reclaiming the real revolution from the grasp of the elites. On social media, once restored in fragments through VPNs, hashtags like Tanzania Awakens and Wildlife Voices of Fire trended across East Africa. Yet, the humanitarian cost continued to rise. Independent monitors estimated over 30 confirmed deaths and hundreds more missing. Amnesty International called for an independent investigation, but no government response came. Instead, state media broadcast images of soldiers delivering food to affected areas, an attempt to rewrite the narrative from uprising to restoration of order. Internationally, Tanzania's image as one of Africa's most stable democracies began to crumble. Foreign investors froze contracts, and neighboring nations grew uneasy. Even Kenya and Uganda, often diplomatic allies, publicly distanced themselves from Suluhu's administration. A leaked EU report suggested that sanctions were under consideration, particularly against senior CCM officials linked to human rights violations. But perhaps the most profound change was psychological. Tanzanians had crossed a line of fear, and once crossed, it could not be redrawn. The government might regain control of the streets, but it had lost control of the people's imagination. As one protester said before being arrested, "You can jail the voice, but not the echo." That echo now lives in every Tanzanian who watched their city burn and realized that obedience had cost them their dignity. And in that awakening, painful, chaotic, and uncertain, Tanzania began to glimpse a truth many had long forgotten: democracy cannot survive without courage. From Washington to Brussels, from Nairobi to Addis Ababa, the images coming out of Tanzania sent quiet shockwaves through diplomatic circles. In the corridors of power, officials watched as one of East Africa's most stable nations slid into chaos, and they knew it wasn't just another domestic dispute. This was the collapse of an illusion, the illusion that stability can exist without justice. In the United States, analysts at the State Department and the Pentagon issued conflicting assessments. Some viewed President Samia Suluhu Hassan as a necessary ally in a region increasingly influenced by China. Others warned that her heavy-handed tactics would push Tanzania into deeper unrest, or worse, spark a wave of anti-Western sentiment similar to what had emerged in the Sahel. A memo leaked from a congressional subcommittee reportedly described the situation as a test of American credibility in Africa's new era. Publicly, the U.S. Embassy in Dar es Salaam limited its words to safety warnings, urging American citizens to stay indoors. But behind the scenes, conversations turned to geopolitics. Washington feared that as Suluhu's legitimacy weakened, Tanzania might turn toward Moscow or Beijing, following the pattern seen in Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, countries now aligned under the AES alliance that rejects Western control. In Europe, the tone was sharper. The European Union released a joint statement condemning what it called a manipulated election process and disproportionate state violence. Human rights organizations in Germany and France demanded sanctions, drawing parallels between Tanzania's crackdown and past colonial patterns of suppression. But as usual, the EU's response stopped at words, diplomatic concern without concrete action. Across the continent, the reaction was mixed. Kenya and Uganda, once Tanzania's close partners, expressed regret while tightening border security. South Africa called for dialogue, but its statement carried no real weight. Within the African Union, debates began quietly about whether to invoke the AU Charter on Democracy and Governance, a move that would formally censure Suluhu's government. Yet no consensus emerged. Too many African leaders recognized their own reflections in her situation. Meanwhile, in West Africa, commentators drew striking comparisons between Tanzania's uprising and the revolutionary awakenings of the Sahel bloc, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. What happened in Tanzania, one Burkinabe journalist wrote, is the same cry that echoed from Ouagadougou to Bamako. Africa is tired of elections without choices. This sentiment resonated deeply among older Americans and Africans alike, those who remember the Cold War years when Washington and Moscow fought for influence, while African lives paid the price. Many asked, has the world learned nothing? Independent American outlets began airing documentaries linking the unrest to a broader generational revolt across the global South, from Nairobi's Gen Z marches to protests in Cameroon and Sudan. Commentators on U.S. talk shows warned that ignoring these movements could backfire. If America keeps defending autocrats in the name of stability, it will lose the trust of the next African generation. And perhaps that was the truest global takeaway. The rebellion in Tanzania wasn't only Tanzanian. It was part of a continental pattern, a quiet African reformation challenging the old order of power and dependency. While Washington hesitated and Brussels moralized, Africa was rewriting its story in the streets. The question now facing the West is not how to contain this fire, but whether it will finally listen to the voices rising from its smoke. Tanzania now stands in the long shadow of its own awakening. The fires may have dimmed the streets, may have quieted, but what has been unleashed cannot be undone. Beneath the ashes lies a question that reaches far beyond Dar es Salaam or Dodoma, a question that touches every nation where power speaks louder than people. What happens when the governed no longer believe in the rules of the game? For decades, Tanzania was praised as the oasis of peace, a model of African stability. But peace without justice is only silence wearing a mask. On October 30th, that mask fell. The world saw the face of a nation tired of obedience, where men and women chose courage over comfort, truth over fear. It was not just an election, it was a reckoning, one that revealed how fragile even the most respected democracies can be when citizens are treated as spectators, not participants. And yet within this chaos lies a rare kind of hope. Every act of defiance, from the woman shouting in the smoke to the student lighting a candle at night, carries the seed of a new beginning. A generation has found its voice, and it will not be silenced again. Tanzania's awakening is painful, yes, but it is also necessary, because democracy, real democracy, is not built in comfort. It is forged in struggle. The world is watching. But more importantly, Africa is watching. From Nairobi to Ouagadougou, from Accra to Bamako, young Africans see themselves in Tanzania's reflection, people who are no longer content to live beneath the weight of systems designed to contain them. And so the story continues, a story about power and dignity, about fear and awakening, about a continent quietly rewriting its destiny in the language of resistance. Perhaps this moment will one day be remembered, not for the smoke that rose, but for the light that followed. Do you think this uprising will lead to a new kind of African democracy, one born from courage rather than compromise? Or will it be another story buried under the weight of silence? Share this video if you believe truth must never be silenced. Comment below if you stand with those who refuse to bow. Subscribe if you believe, like many of us do, that Africa's awakening has only just begun, and that voices like those in Tanzania deserve to be heard across the world. Because as history reminds us, every empire begins with power, but every revolution begins with a voice.